All right, in this video, I will be covering light-independent reactions. So we spent quite a few days on the light-dependent reactions, talking about photosystem 2, the electron transport chain, photosystem 1 to ATP synthase or ATP production, and what are the products of light-dependent reactions. We make ATP and NADPH and oxygen. The oxygen gets released into the atmosphere, but the ATP and the NADPH move on to be used in the light-independent reactions. So let's take a closer look there. Okay, so ATP and NADPH that were created in the light-dependent reactions are going to be used to make sugars. Light-independent reactions are also known as the Kelvin cycle, and the Kelvin cycle was discovered by a man named Melvin Kelvin. So they named it the Kelvin cycle. So it starts off with CO2. So remember the products, scratch that. Remember the reactants of photosynthesis. What goes into a plant? Water, CO2, and a little bit of sunlight. And we make sugars and oxygen. So the Kelvin cycle starts with CO2, and it's going to enter into the Kelvin cycle from the atmosphere. Now, CO2, we're going to be counting carbons here. CO2 has one carbon. So it's a one carbon molecule. And it enters, and it's going to combine with a 5-carbon molecule. And when that happens, it's going to immediately split into 2 3-carbon molecules. And you're like, what? Wait a minute. Glucose. You know, we're trying to make sugar here. And I think I had you write down the chemical formula for sugar. It is C6H12O6. How many carbons are in glucose? C6. 6. So 1 plus 5, yay, 6, but all of a sudden it splits into 3. Wait, where's the sugar? So, yeah, weird, right? So here's the light-independent reactions. Like carbon dioxide is going to enter, and it's going to combine, so it's a 1-carbon molecule, combined with a 5-carbon, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it's going to immediately split into 12 3-carbon molecules. And then we're going to use ATP and NADPH and reconfigure it a little bit, maneuver some atoms around, and then 2 are going to get set aside from the 12, and 10 are going to move on. Using some more energy, remodify, change that 3-carbon molecule back to a 5-carbon molecule. Okay, so let's focus this. 1-carbon molecule, carbon dioxide, enter in and combine in with this 5-carbon molecule to turn into 12 3-carbon molecules. So let's start over. CO2 enters the Kelvin cycle. 6 CO2 molecules, 6 1-carbon molecules, enter and combine with 6 5-carbon molecules, which immediately split into our 12 3-carbon molecules. All of this is being powered by ATP and NADPH. And when they are used, what do they turn into? ATP becomes ADP, and NADPH becomes NADP+. Midway through the Kelvin cycle, 2 of the 12 3-carbon molecules, they get set aside. And those will eventually become sugars, lipids, amino acids, some other complex carbohydrate of some sort or macromolecule. The remaining 10 will move on and be converted back into 5-carbon compounds using more energy. And then the cycle's going to repeat itself. So why does it have to go from 3-carbon back to the 5-carbon molecule again? What's the big deal with this 5-carbon molecule? This is a diagram showing midway through, 2 3-carbon molecules are going to get set aside, and they're going to be turned into sugars or other compounds. And then the 10 move on. But what is so important about this 5-carbon molecule? That 5-carbon molecule is called ribulose bisphosphate, RUBP. And it is created by an enzyme called Ribisco. Okay, I'll type in Ribisco. You can see that the name Ribisco is kind of this conglomerate of ribulose bisphosphate, and then bis, and then I don't know where they get the co from, for Ribisco. Ribisco is the most abundant protein on Earth. It's found in all photosynthetic plants. It's estimated that there's 22 pounds of Ribisco for every person on planet Earth. Okay? However, this enzyme is slow and inefficient. Okay? It can only take between 2 to 8 molecules of carbon dioxide a second compared to thousands per second for most enzymes. It's really, really slow. And the reason why it's slow is because this came about, okay, in a time when there wasn't a lot of, well, our atmospheric compositions were different today versus, millions of years ago. And it hasn't adapted to our modern atmosphere composition. So I'm sure there's a reason why it hasn't, but it hasn't adapted. And so there's some limits with agriculture productivity. It's not very efficient. This is the diagram, another diagram, just showing the Kelvin cycle and how it's actually broken down into 3 stages. We have a carbon fixation where CO2 comes in, and there's my rubisco. Okay. And then it immediately breaks down into a 3-carbon molecule, and you can see with energy, ATP, as well as some electrons, NADPH, it gets modified a little bit, and it turns into a 3-carbon molecule called G3P. And this is where we're going to set aside one G3P molecule, and then the rest will move on. And then it will go around and we'll set aside another G3P molecule. And then when you have 3 plus 3, you get 6, and you can make glucose and other organic compounds. So the first stage, carbon fixation, reduction, means that we're modifying it, but we're using energy in the process. And then the regeneration of our RUBP, so that way we can take in more CO2. So what can the 2 3-carbon molecules turn into? They can turn into starch, glucose, cellulose, amino acids, and proteins, as well as lipids. So lots of different avenues for those G3P or 3-carbon molecules. So in summary, with our light-dependent reactions, water, light go into the chloroplast, specifically in the thylakoid membrane. Water splits, electrons go through the photosystem tube down to the electron transport chain. When it's traveling through the ETC, hydrogen gets pumped across, and then those electrons go to photosystem tube and get re-energized and get picked up by NADPH. The hydrogen ions that got pumped across, they're going to go through ATP synthase, and they're going to make ATP. When water splits, oxygen is made. So then ATP and NADPH are used in creating RUBP, so that way CO2 can be brought in. 1 carbon molecule, 5 carbon molecule splits down into 12 3-carbon molecules, gets reduced. We're using energy over here and NADPH as well. But here we set aside 1 3-carbon molecule and then regenerate that 5-carbon molecule. Goes around again, set aside a J3P molecule. Okay, now you can make something with it. So that's the light independent reactions in a nutshell.